Chapter 3, Bondage. Mayo Kilo. I stared at Kino's flushed face. Why does he have to be so sickly? I asked. Pyper shook her head. It's his leg. It's been festering since a hubbub bit it. I stared at Kino's wound. It had grown better since the last time I tended to it. Where's Quila? I asked. I looked for the plump girl, but she was nowhere in sight. Morning, Pyper answered. Her eyes got watery, and I felt sorry for Arden. He was, in a way, a friend. He helped us rescue Kino, and for that, I will always be grateful. I miss him, Pyper said. He was like a brother to me. Pyper did not cry, but I knew she was very close to crying. I put an arm around her shoulders to make her feel better and kept my mouth shut as I did not know the appropriate words to say in such a situation. After a while, I said, he's a good friend, and he will be missed. Pyper nodded and kept silent. I know what you did, Pyper said. I stared at her face. There were traces of vomit all around you and Kino, and I knew what you did, she repeated. I blushed. I needed to help him. He was so pale and hot when I found him. I paused. I did my best, but look at him, still unwell. Pyper smiled at me. It was such a sweet, sweet smile. I know, she said. You're a true friend, Mayo. I'm sorry about the things I said before about your calling Kino a murderer. I know you're loose with words, but your heart is in the right place. I kept blushing. It was a good thing the door burst open, and Mistress Lamare entered. She saw us huddled together. Her face was somber too. Quila is sleeping. Goemi ran away to the woods, she sighed. I'll let her be for a while. I wondered where Crazy Miro was. Pyper had told me how Arden died, and I would love to wrap my hands around Miro's insane neck and strangle him. Mistress Lamare pulled a chair beside Kino's bed and gazed at him. Her eyes were confused, and I could sense a trace of worry underneath them. She reached out to touch his face, and her hand rested on his cheek, cupping the right side of his face where an ugly scar traced the length of his cheek. Quila told me the general called her Lamare Amerk, I whispered to Pyper. Her eyes rounded. Really? Then, she must now believe Kino's her son, she said. I don't know. If she still doesn't, I don't know what will make her believe anymore. Watching Mistress Lamare and Kino, my heart swelled, and I almost cried. I wished Kino would wake up now so he could see his mother. I could only hope that Mistress Lamare's memory would return. Goemi was still a problem because she would not admit that Nia was really Lamare. But I could sense that once she saw the truth in what I was saying and the raw emotion in Kino's eyes, she would finally tell the truth. Do you remember anything now? I asked, addressing Mistress Lamare. She withdrew her hand as though she was burned. She shook her head slowly while her eyes fixed on Kino's face. I don't remember him at all, she said. Pyper was watching Mistress Lamare too. If it helps, Pyper started, Mayo is telling the truth. Mistress Lamare looked confused. I'm not saying that he isn't. It's just that I don't remember anything. He's going to get better now, right, Mayo? Pyper asked me. I frowned. I don't know. All I did was remove the vileness festering in his leg, but who's to say? He's been having a fever for weeks, and I don't know how badly he's been infected. All we can do now is hope, I answered. Long before I discovered the significance of my power, I thought all I could ever do was remove harmful components from food. But when Pyper was bitten by a serpetus, and I managed to suck out the snake's poison, I realized the gods had given me a rare gift. It was like healing in a way. I wished using it on Kino would work like it did on Pyper. Mistress Lamare looked at us. We've had a long, hard journey. I think you should go to sleep now. We will leave early tomorrow, so you need to take the rest. Where are we to go now? No household would ever take us in, I said. Mistress Lamare stared at Pyper. Do you think the Nivens would welcome us? Pyper stared back at her. Her lips opened slightly. I think my father would want nothing else but that, she said. Good. Then, we will push for Nivedon, Mistress Lamare said. I stood up, and my stomach growled. Darn this stomach. Come on, Pyper, I said. Let's get some sleep. Pyper stood up too and bent over Kino. She pressed a kiss against his sweaty forehead. She looked down at him with worried eyes. You'll watch over him? Mistress Lamare nodded. She'll watch over him, I whispered to her. And Kino would want that. Pyper did not move from where she stood, awaiting Mistress Lamare's confirmation. Mistress Lamare smiled kindly at us and nodded. I'll watch over Kino for you. Go now. Pyper and I turned away and settled in a space where we could get some rest. As the hours passed, I lay beside Pyper, wondering when everything would go back to normal. I wondered how my grandma was doing in our village. Did she get to take care of my dog, Brew? I missed Brew so suddenly that my heart clenched. I thought about my parents as I lay in the darkness. Do they ever miss me? Remembering how Lamare looked at Kino even though she had no memory of him made me jealous. My parents had never looked at me in that manner. Not that I could recall. Renner Kalo is the greatest general Akia ever had, at least that's what everybody tells me. And Bettina Toon Kalo is an excellent swordsman. My parents never had time for me. Regardless of all the gold coins I had, I felt pretty miserable because of that. I prayed to the moons that one day when all this was over, I could at least spend a night with my parents because, although I hated to admit it, I had no memory of us happily spending time together. It is high time we fix that. Kino Amerk. I remembered the kind soldier who gave me water when I was captured by the evil general. His name was Rygansair. He was. I wondered how he was doing now. Even dreaming, I felt my heart burn as I sympathized over the pain of Rygan's loss even though it had happened long ago. He had lost his wife and son, whereas I lost my mother. I did not know if two pains could ever be comparable. I guessed that it could not. I like to think of it this way. Rygan's loss had made him a better man because his anguish made him empathize with me. Hence, he helped me escape the general. Every time I remembered Rygan's name, I would utter it with reverence. The ones who had no one else to live for, by force of nature, become unafraid to risk their lives. Rygan was one of them, and perhaps that was why he was able to save me. He carried me away from the room's confines as Pyper held my hand to make me invisible. If Rygan had not helped, there was no doubt in my mind I would not have been able to escape. No matter how smart Pyper was, she would not have been able to carry me. I tossed in bed, eyes closed, and did not want to wake again. If I remained ill, would all the pain in my heart stop? The face of a boy that lay on the ground unmoving filled my thoughts. He was my hero. I felt another strain of pain slicing through my chest, and my eyes watered. I wondered what his death would do to Quila. I mean, if it were Pyper or Mayo that I lost to the soldiers, I don't know. It would be worse than death itself. They were parts of me now. The only family I had. I was pretty sure Quila felt the same way towards Arden. It was entirely my fault. I cried harder. If I did not go to the Canellan Palace to present, none of this would have happened. The Emperor would not have paid attention to me, and my mother would still be alive. I tossed in bed again, trying to chase away the guilty feeling. I felt nauseated, and my stomach complained about not having to eat for a long time, but I did not want to eat. I could not, even if the best cakes were set before me. My pain was much greater than any hunger I could ever get to feel. The last sniffler's death still weighed me down. Men had to die because of me, and it wasn't a good feeling. I did not want to ever wake up again. I stirred in bed and kicked as a hot slicing pain shot up from my left leg towards my torso. Would I ever be well enough to climb the trees again? Or swim? Or run? Would anything ever be the same again? I wished for the 100th time that my mother was still here with me. Burning up, I gasped for air and tugged at the blanket covering me. Although my temperature was up, I felt cold all over. Mother, I whispered. Mother, please. Then, the most incredible thing happened. A warm hand on my forehead comforted me. It brought me home, back to the cottage in Wawang village. The faded memory of my mother's caress was brought back to life, and I smiled despite my tears. Sometimes, the gods seemed to hear my pleas too. Right now, a simple act of tenderness was all I wanted. "Sleep now, Kino," a voice said. "Everything will be better in the morning," she said. "Everything will be better in the morning." The words haunted me like a memory from a long time ago, back to that moment when I was sick, and my mother would assure me I would be well the following day. I longed to open my eyes and, amidst the candlelight, find my mother's face staring down lovingly at me. And there would be no other words needed to console me. I smiled at the memory. Dreams were fleeting? Dreams were illusions. And yet, for tonight, I wondered who this person was who took the time to care for me. Slowly, I opened my eyes, and even though I was burning with fever, I wondered if my eyes were playing a trick on me as I stared into my mother's face. Her eyes were the warm glow of caramel brown I remembered fondly. The look she gave me, although distant, seemed to genuinely care. "Mother?" I whispered. "Is it really you?"
Mia pass up. I froze. This delirious boy laid eyes on me, and those were the first things he said. How can they not be true? Was I really his mother? And yet, I could not feel something inside of me except confusion. The general's surprise as he searched my face filled me with wonder. He had called me Lamare without hesitation, as though she was who I really was. Should I believe in Mayo now? Tonight, as Kino lay sick, do I have the guts to counter his claims? Would it be a kindness to say that yes, it is indeed I, albeit knowing it could be a lie? Or would it be the exact opposite of that? "Sleep now and come back to me in the morning," I whispered and smiled at him. Kino's eyes flickered. His tears kept welling, and I felt sorry for the boy that had suffered so much at the hands of the Emperor's men. Kino smiled at me and reached out to touch my face. As his hands cupped my cheeks, it was impossible not to have my heart melt with affection. I inhaled slowly and deeply and met his gaze before I leaned over and kissed his forehead like it was second nature to me. My lips rested longer than they should, and I closed my eyes. Maybe it was the moment, the darkness shrouding us, or the situation of being so helpless in the midst of Sinista that made me want to assure this boy that everything would be better in the morning. All I knew was that, right now, I would find nothing more satisfying than to cradle him in my arms. But I had another son somewhere far away. Someone who I should be thinking of and worrying about. Miro had run away from us after he... I choked. After he ended Arden's life. I tensed and moved away from Kino. I touched his hair and continued caressing it until the boy fell asleep on the cot made from an assortment of leaves and hay. The stars flickered outside the window, and I wondered when my memories would return. True, Mayo and Pyper claiming that I was Lamare Amric did not seem real. But when it was the boy who said I was his mother, and then, there was the general. Could I really be that woman? I mean, what about Goami and Miro? What about Jor Passap? The man that my twins claimed was my husband. How could anybody ever really be sure about who he or she was if there are no memories? I was supposed to be the one to know everything about myself, and yet. My heart felt cold, and I did not know if it was because of the weather or because of losing Miro out in the wild world. Or was it because of Goami's pain upon learning of Arden's death? Or was it because of losing Arden to the hands of my own son? I clutched at my shawl and shivered. I wished I knew which was real and who was telling me the truth. A figure was silhouetted by the moon's light. "Mama?" Goami whispered. "Are you awake?" I sat up straight rapidly. Then, I stood up and ran towards Goami. She must have been so hurt. Upon reaching her, I embraced her tightly, and in the darkness of the room, I let her cry against my shoulder. When it became tiring for us to weep over the same lad, I motioned for her to sit down. There were not enough dried leaves to make the ground softer for us, but the tiredness of the body won, so we just lay down on the ground. Kino was to my far right, while Goami was beside me on my left side. It was unfair that I did not know who between them was my real child. But tonight, I knew who needed me more. So, I did not move from where I already was, and instead, I reached out to Goemi and guided her head gently to lay against my chest. I fell asleep cradling my daughter in my arms. Quila Tash. I sat staring at the sword Arden used to carry with him. It seemed surreal that he had this all along, and it was only in the last few months that we were together that I got to learn about it. I knew nothing about swords. I did not know how to use one, but I had to keep his memory alive, and for that, I vowed to always carry the ruby-gilded sword with me. In the darkness, a patch of light grazed the blade, and it shone. My tears rolled down, and I had to rub against my cheeks with the back of my hand. How could anybody hate Arden so much as to kill him? He was the epitome of kindness. Arg. I hate myself for being this melodramatic, but Arden was kind, beautiful, and all the nice things put together. All right, I admit he had his faults, but regardless, how could anyone have hated him so much to freeze his heart? I hate Miro. When I get to wield this sword, I will use it on him. I did not realize that I was holding the sword so tightly until my arms started to shake. I stood up and swung the sword in the air, tearing at whatever was in front of me. Except that there was nothing. I lifted the sword, ran away, and stopped when I was right in front of a tree. Then, I slashed and slashed at the trunk. I was so angry at the world that I continued to hit the tree repeatedly, hoping I could make it fall down. If it did, maybe then, I would feel vindicated. There was no one to call me chum anymore. No one would tease me about eating so much. No one would carry my box and stand beside me as I played with my puppets. The traveling show, the magic circus that we had wanted to build, none of it would ever happen. I mustered all my strength and hit the trunk again as hard as possible. The blade wedged into the tree trunk, and I could not force it out. It was as though the world was telling me to stop being childish. I let go of the sword and grabbed something from my belt. I felt the velvet pouch that held all of Arden's coins. I opened it and stared at the gold coins. They glinted, too, like the sword's blade did moments ago. Slowly, I fished the coins out and held them in my hand. Then, one by one, I threw them all away. It was at that moment that Pyper came out and ran towards me. "Stop!" she yelled. "Keep them. Arden would have wanted you to chase after your dream." I looked at her in anger. "What does it matter to you? This is all your fault." I yelled at her. Mayo started to pick up the coins. He was holding a bunch of them. "Drop them. Drop them, or I'll kill you with Arden's sword," I yelled. It was Mayo's jaw that dropped. Then, I moved to tug at the sword again, grunting. However, the blade would not give way. I slipped and fell and succumbed to crying, burying my face in my hands. There was a movement beside me. "I miss him too," Pyper said in a solemn voice. I shook as I sobbed. No one could ever know how lost I was without Arden. Not even Goemi could fathom the pain Arden's demise had left behind. Pyper, San Diego. It was a gloomy day, and the skies could not have chosen a worse time to shower us with rain. All around me, everyone was feeling sad. It was as though the world had stopped turning with Arden's death, and I could not blame anyone for feeling that way. Even though I had known him for a short time, he left me with many memories. Enough to weigh down my soul with the grief of losing a friend. I wondered when we'd be all right again. "Did you see Kino?" Mayo asked. I looked at him and noticed he seemed to be the only one who was not so much affected by Arden's loss. "I haven't," I said. "Has he woken up yet?" Mayo sat beside me and shook his head. "I didn't have the guts to check on him," he said. "I don't want to see him so upset. I mean, with all that's going on, I don't think I can manage to eat if another person would add to this gloominess." I looked away. Mayo was right. Even when he was so stubborn and brutal with words, sometimes, he displayed a sensitivity that could touch even the coldest of hearts. "Maybe we should wait and see," I replied. "I hope that Kino will deal with it better than how we're dealing with Arden's loss." Mayo remained quiet. "The sun's up. Shouldn't we get going?" I looked up. "I don't have the energy to take the journey yet." Mayo nodded and put his chubby chin on top of his knees. After a while, he asked, "Do you think everything will be back to the way it was before?" "Maybe," I said. Mayo frowned. "Let's check on Kino," I said before standing up abruptly. He said, his eyes clouded. What? Come on. I said. Maybe he's already up. I paused. You've got great power. If there's anyone among us who could help him, it's you. You saved my life before. Your power can work on him too. Mayo looked pleased, but the trace of a frown did not leave his face entirely before he stood up. Under the massive collection of leaves that served as the roof for whatever abode one might call this, whatever it was we're living in, Kino lay in a makeshift bed. Mistress Lumare or Nia, whichever she may be, was moving around, cooking. Goemi looked horrible. Her eyes were red, and her hair was uncombed. My heart went out to her. I kept my mouth shut because I knew that anything I said would only trigger her pain, and she would end up crying again. I walked over to Kino and checked on him. Mayo, he's well. I gasped. Mayo's face broke into a huge grin. Surprisingly, he hugged Kino. Get up, man. Get up and meet the rising sun. He shouted. I laughed. It was a good day to start anew. Then, lightning split the sky and thunder roared. Mayo looked outside the window. Oops, spoke too soon, he said sheepishly with a smile still pasted on his face. Kino stirred and opened his eyes. He stared at me. Good morning to you too, I said, smiling at him. Kino smiled thinly. Hi, he said. It was the most beautiful voice I had heard in a long time. Your fever has broken. And your wound, I said and studied his leg, seems to be healing nicely. You have Mayo to thank for that. Kino grinned at Mayo, and no words needed to be spoken. Then, as though Kino remembered something, his countenance changed. He stood up from the cot and winced when he stepped using his left leg. Careful now, I said as I put an arm around his waist. I'm all right, Kino insisted, wriggling away from me. Really, I can. Mistress Lumare entered, and Kino froze. Mom. Is it really you? He asked. Mistress Lumare's face paled. She stood motionless several paces away from all of us. Kino limped as he walked over to Mistress Lumare. He hopped as he tried to run and make the gap narrow between them. Kino dived into Mistress Lumare's arms, and though she seemed to be caught off guard, she managed to put her arms around Kino and rested her chin on the top of his head. I can't believe it's you. Kino said. I missed you so much, Mom. You have no idea how much. Through it all, Mistress Lumare did not say anything. Mayo and I stood there watching. Kino pulled back and stared at Mistress Lumare. What's wrong? He asked her. He looked at Mayo and me. What's wrong? He insisted. His voice had taken an edge. Why won't you talk to me? Mistress Lumare cleared her throat and opened her mouth as though to speak. But words did not find their way out of her lips. Kino, I said, she doesn't remember any of us. Kino stared widely at me. He looked at Mistress Lumare before looking back at me again. What? He asked. His face had gone ashen. What do you mean? Mayo and I could not say a word because, honestly, how do you tell a friend that his mother lost all memories, good and bad, including those that involved their lives together? You've got to remember me, Mom. You're my mother. I'm your son. We lived in Wawang village. You write for the Emperor. You have to remember me. Kino's voice broke. Oh, Kino, Mistress Lumare said and moved closer to embrace him. Kino grappled at Mistress Lumare's waist, pulling her in a tight embrace. Don't you remember any of it? Mistress Lumare shook her head sadly. I will make you remember. I will tell you everything you need to know. Mistress Lumare held him close. Get some more rest. We'll talk when you're a lot better. No. I thought I lost you forever without getting the chance to see you one last time, without being able to talk to you. Without being able to tell you, I love you. It was horrible, Mom. I can't be in that nightmare again. I won't. I won't waste my time lying around just because I need to rest. Being with you is much more important. Then, to my surprise, Kino broke into sobs. I looked at Mayo and pulled at his hand. We weren't supposed to hear everything, and I thought it was time we left them alone. Whatever it was that they would discuss, we could learn later on from Kino. Come on, I said softly. Mayo would not budge, though. Huh? He said. Let's go and give them privacy. But I want to hear everything, Mayo complained. Kino was still sobbing, and Mistress Lamare tried to calm him down. Shut it, I hushed and all but dragged Mayo away. I was still fuming at his insensitivity when I saw Goemi. Her eyes were red and watery as she stared at Kino and Mistress Lamare. Quila was beside her. She looked as forlorn and wrinkled as Goemi did. I turned to look back at Kino and Mistress Lamare, and my heart ached at the grim picture they painted. You should tell her the truth, I said to Goemi. She flinched, but her eyes remained fixed on Lamare. Her lips quivered before she opened them. I lost Arden. I lost Miro, she paused. I won't lose my mother too, she said in a soft yet determined voice. What makes you think I'm lying? Gods, I hope Mistress Lamare regained her memories because I did not know what to think anymore. Who was telling the truth?
Louis Mancia. I was glad to be on my own again. I liked the general, and he has inspired me to aspire to be a warrior, but the problem was that I was always supposed to work alone. My power was stealth. I could catch people off guard and track people. I could see the signs and traces of other people's presence when nobody else could. But my power only manifested when I was on my own. Right then, I could sense the general's son. We were not far from each other. If the general had not pushed straight to Canella, he might have crossed paths with his son. 100 miles from the general's son, and I could already sense him. Each step I took brought me closer to the boy. In a few days, I would not be surprised if I found him before me. I closed my eyes and felt myself connect to the world. In the emptiness of my mind, one by one, faces appeared. I saw Mayo walking beside a grayish girl. There were other children and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I opened my eyes. Was that Lamare? How did she end up with Mayo and the other children? If it were really Lamare, the royal scribe, I would be in for a great reward from the emperor. But what about the masked warriors? What about everything that we hope to achieve? I believe in the masked warriors. That we had something worth fighting for. But do we stand a chance? I mean, there were numerous soldiers who wanted to fight the emperor and replace him with someone better. Who's to say that the one that would replace McQuinn Stormarin would be a more fit ruler? Someone better than him? No one could guarantee that. My fealty to Renarcolo was to find his son. I said nothing about finding Lamare. If I could hand her to the emperor, I'm sure I would not have to remain a soldier. I mean, I loved the general. I liked what I did. But I did not want to be a soldier that slept anywhere night found him. It wasn't the life I would have subscribed to, given a choice. A small estate would be enough for me, and a lady. If I could get the emperor to give me these, I would leave soldiering. I prayed to the gods for guidance. I kicked at my horse and rode onward. This time, I had 2 goals in mind. Take Mayo. And after that, take Lamare and live in a remote estate far from all the chaos of Akean.